Tonight, we step into the shadow of the longest winter Europe ever knew. A winter not of snow, but of silence. Picture streets that once rang with merchants' calls now empty, save for the rumble of carts carrying the dead. Imagine cathedrals filled not with hymns, but with the desperate prayers of those who believed God had turned his face away. This is not a story of kings and conquests, though both fell before it. This is a story of something far more terrifying, the fragility of everything we build, and how quickly it can all come undone. So before we descend into those plague-darkened years, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're truly drawn to these forgotten corners of history. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always humbling to see how far these stories can travel across the world. Now, dim the lights, silence your phone, and let yourself sink into the past. Because what you're about to hear is not just history, it's a reminder of how thin the line between civilization and chaos truly is. The story begins, as all great human stories do, with a moment of quiet before the storm. In the year 1340, Europe hummed with a vitality it had not known for centuries. From the wool markets of Flanders to the banking houses of Florence, from the bustling ports of Venice to the rising spires of Paris, Christendom stood at a peak of confidence and ambition. The high Middle Ages had delivered prosperity, population growth, and architectural marvels that seemed to scrape the very heavens. Gothic cathedrals rose like stone prayers, their stained glass windows filtering divine light onto congregations swelling with every generation. The population of Europe had nearly doubled since the year 1000, reaching perhaps 80 million souls. Villages sprawled into towns, towns swelled into cities, and everywhere the sound of construction echoed. New churches, new walls, new futures. Trade routes stretched from London to Constantinople, carrying silk, spices, and silver across a continent knitted together by commerce and Christianity. Scholars at the universities of Bologna, Oxford, and Paris debated theology and philosophy with the fervor of men who believed human reason could unlock the mind of God himself. But beneath this golden surface, cracks had already begun to form. The climate was shifting. What historians now call the medieval warm period was ending, giving way to cooler, wetter seasons. Harvests began to fail with increasing frequency. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had already offered a grim preview. 3 years of relentless rain, rotting crops, and starvation that claimed perhaps 10% of the population. People ate bark, grass, even their own children in the worst-hit regions. Yet Europe recovered, or seemed to. The population rebounded. Markets reopened. Life, as it always does, continued. Wars raged as they always had. England and France had begun their long, bitter dance that history would call the 100 Years' War. Petty conflicts erupted over succession, territory, and pride. But these were familiar rhythms, the background noise of medieval life. No one suspected that something far more devastating was already in motion, traveling along those same trade routes that had brought such wealth and connection. In the taverns of London, the markets of Bruges, the universities of Prague, people complained about taxes, debated theology, gossiped about scandals. Life felt permanent in the way it always does when you're living it. The future seemed like more of the same. More people, more trade, more cathedrals reaching toward heaven. No one imagined that within a decade, a third of them would be dead. No one could have imagined the silence that was coming. The world stood on the edge of an abyss, but all anyone could see was the solid ground beneath their feet. The story of the Black Death does not begin in Europe. It begins thousands of miles to the east, in the vast steppes and trading posts of Central Asia, where empires rose and fell like grass in the wind. Somewhere in the region we now call Kazakhstan or Mongolia, in the 1330s, something ancient stirred to life. A bacterium, Yersinia pestis, living quietly in the fleas of marmots and other rodents, suddenly found new hosts. Perhaps climate change drove the rodents closer to human settlements. Perhaps increased trade brought people into territories they had avoided before. Whatever the cause, the result was catastrophic. The plague moved along the Silk Road, that ancient artery of commerce that connected east and west. Merchants carrying silk, spices, and precious metals also carried infected fleas in their cargo, in their clothing, in the very ships and caravans that symbolized human progress and connection. By 1338, records from trading posts near Lake Issyk-Kul in present-day Kyrgyzstan mention unusual numbers of deaths. Gravestones from that period bear inscriptions suggesting pestilence, but these were distant lands, unknown to most Europeans. The whispers of death in the east went unheard in the west. The Mongol Empire, which had united much of Asia under a single rule, inadvertently became the highway for the plague's westward journey. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, had opened trade routes and facilitated travel on an unprecedented scale. Caravans that once took years now moved with relative safety and speed. Cities along these routes grew wealthy and cosmopolitan. But every coin, every bolt of silk, every trader who passed through carried the potential for infection. By 1346, the plague had reached the Mongol territories on the shores of the Black Sea. At the trading port of Kaffa, in what is now Crimea, a dramatic moment occurred that would seal Europe's fate. The Mongol army, laying siege to the Genoese-controlled city, found their own ranks decimated by disease. In an act that some historians consider one of the first instances of biological warfare, the Mongols catapulted their plague-infected corpses over the city walls. Whether this truly spread the disease or whether it would have entered the city regardless remains debated. What is certain is that the Italian merchants inside Kaffa fled in terror, boarding their ships and sailing for home. They carried more than memories of horror. In the holds of their ships, in the folds of their clothes, in the fur of the rats that scurried through the dark spaces below deck, traveled countless fleas. And in those fleas lived the bacterium that would reshape the world. The ships made port at Constantinople, at Messina in Sicily, at Marseille, at Venice. Each port became a new point of infection, a new spark in what would become a continental inferno. Europe, in its confidence and its connections, had built the perfect conditions for its own devastation. The roads and sea routes that had brought prosperity now brought death, and there was no way to close the gates once they had been opened. The people of medieval Europe could not see what was killing them. They had no microscopes, no understanding of bacteria or disease vectors. What they experienced was terror without explanation, a hidden enemy that struck seemingly at random, respecting neither walls nor prayers. The plague arrived in multiple forms, each more horrifying than the last, and each feeding the panic that would eventually consume entire societies. The most common form was bubonic plague, named for the buboes, grotesque swellings of the lymph nodes, that appeared in the groin, armpits, and neck of the infected. These buboes could grow as large as apples, filled with pus and blood, and caused excruciating pain. The victim would develop a high fever, experience delirium, and often die within a week. The buboes sometimes burst, releasing foul-smelling discharge, and those who witnessed this never forgot the sight or the smell. Mortality rates for untreated bubonic plague hovered around 50 to 60%. Terrible odds, but not certain death. But there were worse forms. Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs, spreading through respiratory droplets when an infected person coughed or spoke. This form was almost universally fatal, killing within 2 to 3 days. Victims coughed up blood, their lungs filling with fluid as they slowly drowned on dry land. The pneumonic form was also far more contagious, passing directly from person to person without need for fleas. In crowded medieval cities, where families lived in single rooms and strangers pressed together in markets and churches, pneumonic plague spread like wildfire. The rarest but most deadly form was septicemic plague, where the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. Victims of septicemic plague often died within a single day, sometimes within hours. Their skin turned black from gangrene and hemorrhaging, giving the plague its most famous name, the Black Death. Medieval chroniclers described people going to bed healthy and being found dead by morning, their bodies already darkening with decay. The medieval mind, lacking any scientific framework for disease, grasped for explanations that made sense within their worldview. Many believed the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins, God's wrath made manifest for the pride, greed, and moral corruption of Christendom. Astrologers pointed to a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345, claiming the alignment had corrupted the air itself. Physicians spoke of miasma, poisoned air rising from swamps or created by rotting matter, that could be smelled and therefore avoided. Others blamed earthquakes for releasing toxic vapors from the Earth's core. Some turned to scapegoating. Jewish communities faced horrific persecution, accused of poisoning wells or conspiring with the devil to destroy Christianity. In city after city, Jewish populations were rounded up and burned alive, their property seized, their centuries-old communities destroyed. The fact that Jews were dying of plague at similar rates mattered little to the panicked Christian majority seeking someone to blame. No one understood that the true culprit was invisible, a bacterium smaller than the eye could see, carried by fleas that fed on the blood of rats. The rat, that ubiquitous companion of medieval life, scurrying through granaries and homes, was the unwitting harbinger of apocalypse. October 1347. The Genoese merchant ships that fled from Caffa made port in Messina, Sicily. Within days, the plague had established its first European foothold. The disease moved with terrifying speed, following trade routes and rivers, spreading from port to port, city to city, village to village. By January 1348, it had reached Marseille and other Mediterranean ports. By spring, it was in Florence, Paris, and Barcelona. By summer, England. By autumn, Scotland and Ireland. By 1349, Germany and the Low Countries. By 1350, Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. In less than 4 years, the Black Death had swept across the entire continent like a scythe through wheat. Cities bore the brunt of the devastation. In densely packed urban centers, where people lived in close quarters and sanitation was primitive at best, the plague found ideal conditions. Florence lost perhaps 60% of its population. Venice, 50%. Paris, between 30 and 40%. In some smaller towns and villages, the death toll was even higher. Entire communities were wiped out, leaving behind ghost settlements that slowly crumbled back into the earth. The social fabric began to tear. As the plague intensified, normal life became impossible to maintain. Trade stopped. Markets closed. Fields went unplowed and unharvested, as there were not enough living to work the land. The dead accumulated faster than they could be buried. In the early days, families still held proper funerals, priests still administered last rites, and the dead were laid to rest in churchyards with prayers and ceremony. But as the death toll mounted, such niceties became luxuries no one could afford. Mass graves appeared in every city. In London, emergency burial pits were dug that would eventually hold thousands of bodies. The dead were brought by cartload, often naked because there was no time or cloth for shrouds, and dumped into trenches that were covered with quicklime and a thin layer of soil. The living worked frantically to bury the dead before disease spread further, though they did not understand that the corpses themselves were not the primary danger. The stench of death hung over every city like a fog that never lifted. Medical care collapsed entirely. Physicians, those few who remained and did not flee, could offer nothing but bloodletting, lancing of buboes, and prayers. Many of the treatments, such as sitting close to fires or covering oneself in the waste of animals to drive away the miasma, likely did more harm than good. Some doctors wore bizarre protective costumes, including the famous plague doctor mask, with its long, beak-like nose stuffed with aromatic herbs, believing the sweet smells would protect them from poisoned air. It did not work. Physicians died at rates as high as their patients. The church, the bedrock of medieval society, found itself helpless. Priests and monks, obligated by their vows to minister to the dying and sick, died in droves. Monasteries and convents were decimated. Some estimates suggest that 50% of the clergy perished, leaving behind a spiritual vacuum. With no one to perform the sacraments, fear of dying unshriven, without confession and absolution, added psychological terror to physical suffering. People died believing they would be damned for eternity, their souls trapped in purgatory or hell because no priest survived to grant them final rites. Panic gave way to nihilism and despair. Some people, convinced that death was inevitable, abandoned all restraint. They drank, gambled, and indulged in every pleasure, determined to enjoy their final days. Others became hermits, locking themselves away and refusing contact with anyone, hoping isolation would save them. And some turned to religious mania. The flagellants emerged, groups of penitents who traveled from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public displays of penance, believing their suffering might appease God's anger and halt the plague. They sang hymns, marched in procession, and beat their backs with leather scourges embedded with metal spikes until blood soaked their robes. For a time they attracted huge crowds and were seen as holy martyrs, but the church eventually condemned them as heretics, recognizing that their apocalyptic fervor threatened ecclesiastical authority. The flagellants were disbanded, often violently, but the desperation that birthed them never truly disappeared. Europe was collapsing, and no one knew how to stop it. In a village whose name has been lost to history, somewhere in the English countryside in the summer of 1349, a woman named Margaret buried her fourth child in as many weeks. There was no priest to say the words, no one to help her dig the shallow grave behind what had once been her home. Her husband was already dead. Her neighbors were dead. The only sounds were the crows circling overhead and her own ragged breathing as she piled stones atop the tiny mound. When she finished, she sat in the dirt and waited for the fever to take her too. By nightfall, it had. This story, though we do not know Margaret's name or her village, was repeated millions of times across Europe. The Black Death was not merely a statistic or a historical event. It was a deeply personal catastrophe, a collection of countless individual tragedies that together shaped the human experience of an entire continent. Behind every number, 50 million dead, 60% of Florence, half of Paris, were human beings with names, with families, with hopes that died alongside their bodies. Children suffered disproportionately. With weaker immune systems and smaller bodies, they succumbed to the plague faster than adults. Parents faced the unbearable horror of watching their children die, often helpless to even comfort them. In some cases, plague-stricken families were walled up in their homes by authorities attempting to contain the spread, left to die together in the darkness. Survivors reported hearing the cries of those trapped inside, growing weaker day by day until silence fell. The social order, so carefully maintained through feudal hierarchy and custom, disintegrated under the weight of mass death. Servants abandoned their masters. Children left their parents. Priests fled their congregations. The bonds of obligation and loyalty that held medieval society together snapped like overstressed rope. Boccaccio, writing in Florence during the plague, recorded his shock at the breakdown of basic humanity. He wrote of the dead being dragged from homes and left in the streets, of bodies piled outside churches with no one to bury them, of the sick dying alone because even family members would not approach them. Yet amid this darkness, there were also moments of profound humanity. Some physicians stayed at their posts, knowing they would likely die. Some priests continued administering last rites to the very end. Some parents nursed their children through the illness, and some children cared for their parents, even knowing they were exposing themselves to almost certain death. Love did not disappear, even when terror reigned. It simply became more costly, more precious, more aware of its own fragility. Women, often overlooked in medieval records, became visible in their suffering and their strength. With so many men dead, women took on roles previously forbidden to them. They ran businesses, managed estates, and worked fields. Widows, suddenly freed from the legal authority of husbands and fathers, found themselves with autonomy they had never known. This would have lasting effects on gender relations in the post-plague world, though at a cost no one would have chosen. The psychological impact was perhaps as devastating as the physical. Survivors lived with profound trauma, having witnessed horrors that defied comprehension. Many lost entire families. Some woke from fever to find everyone they loved dead around them. The world had become a place of arbitrary cruelty, where children died while the wicked lived, where prayers went unanswered, and where tomorrow was never guaranteed. A deep pessimism settled over European culture, visible in art, literature, and theology for generations to come. The dance of death, danse macabre, emerged as a popular artistic motif, showing skeletons leading people from all walks of life, kings and peasants, bishops and merchants, in a morbid procession. The message was clear: death comes for everyone, regardless of status or virtue. Memento mori, remember you must die, became a constant refrain, a reminder that life was fleeting and earthly concerns ultimately meaningless. For those who survived, life would never be the same. They had looked into the abyss and seen their own helplessness reflected back. The world had become a fundamentally uncertain place, and that uncertainty would shape European consciousness for centuries. The Black Death did not move uniformly across Europe. It followed the pathways of human connection, trade routes, pilgrimage roads, rivers, and coastlines. Major ports and trade hubs were struck first and hardest, while isolated rural areas sometimes escaped entirely or suffered delayed outbreaks. The randomness of survival fed both hope and terror, as people never knew if they had truly escaped or were simply next in line. The plague reached England in June 1348, probably through the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. From there, it spread rapidly through the countryside and into London. King Edward III, ruling from Windsor Castle, watched helplessly as his kingdom was ravaged. Parliament was prorogued because there were not enough members alive to meet. The wool trade, England's economic lifeblood, collapsed as both producers and buyers died or fled. Even the king's own daughter, Princess Joan, died of plague while traveling to Spain for her wedding. No one, regardless of rank, was safe. In France, already devastated by years of war with England, the plague added catastrophe upon catastrophe. Paris lost an estimated 50,000 people. The French countryside, already depopulated by military campaigns, saw entire villages abandoned. Queen Joan of Navarre, wife of King Philip VI, died of plague in 1349. The king, desperate for explanation, ordered physicians at the University of Paris to investigate the cause. Their conclusion, that a conjunction of planets had corrupted the air, offered no practical help whatsoever. Italy, the earliest and perhaps hardest hit region, saw its flourishing city-states brought to their knees. Florence, that jewel of the Renaissance, lost between 50 and 60,000 inhabitants, out of a pre-plague population of perhaps 100,000. The great poet Petrarch lost his beloved Laura to the plague, inspiring some of his most famous verses. Giovanni Boccaccio survived and wrote The Decameron, a collection of stories supposedly told by young people who fled Florence to escape the plague, though his introduction contains some of the most vivid descriptions of plague horror ever written. Venice, with its powerful navy and extensive trade networks, attempted to implement some of the first public health measures. Ships arriving from plague-infected ports were required to anchor offshore for 40 days. A quarantine from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days, before crew or cargo could come ashore. This practice, though imperfectly understood and enforced, did save some lives and would become a foundation of modern public health policy. In the Germanic lands, the plague triggered waves of persecution against Jewish communities. In Strasbourg in February 1349, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in their own cemetery, accused of causing the plague by poisoning wells. In Mainz, the Jewish community fought back against their attackers, killing 200 Christians before being overwhelmed and massacred. Pope Clement VI issued 2 bulls condemning the violence and pointing out that Jews were dying of plague at similar rates as Christians, but his words had little effect. Between 1348 and 1351, hundreds of Jewish communities across Europe were destroyed, their inhabitants murdered or expelled, their centuries of cultural and economic contribution erased in a paroxysm of fear and hatred. Scandinavia was among the last regions struck. The plague reached Norway in 1349, probably via English ships trading for timber and fish. From Norway, it spread to Sweden and Denmark. Iceland, dependent on Norwegian trade, saw the plague arrive in 1402 during a second outbreak and lost perhaps half its population. The demographic catastrophe in Scandinavia was profound, permanently altering settlement patterns and political structures. Eastern Europe and Russia received the plague both from the west and from renewed outbreaks along the Black Sea. The Grand Duchy of Moscow lost its ruler, Grand Prince Simeon, to plague in 1353. Entire Slavic regions were depopulated, creating power vacuums that would shape the political development of Eastern Europe for generations. Even distant and relatively isolated regions could not escape. The plague reached as far as Greenland, where the Norse settlements, already struggling with climate change and isolation, may have been finished off by disease. By 1350, the Greenland Norse had effectively disappeared, their farms abandoned, their churches silent. Whether plague was the primary cause or merely the final blow remains uncertain, but the end was the same. By 1353, the first wave of the Black Death had run its course. Europe, from Portugal to Poland, from Sicily to Scotland, had been transformed. But the plague was not finished with Europe. It would return in waves: 1361, 1374, 1390, 1400, each time killing a significant portion of the population, though never again at the catastrophic scale of 1347 to 1353. The plague became endemic, a regular visitor that shaped the medieval and early modern world for centuries. The disease that had traveled from the steppes of Central Asia had found a permanent home in Europe, and Europeans would live under its shadow for the next 300 years. When the plague finally began to recede in 1353, the survivors emerged into a world transformed beyond recognition. Europe's population had been cut by at least 1/3, possibly as much as 1/2. Entire villages stood empty, their fields gone to seed, their churches silent. In cities, whole neighborhoods were abandoned, buildings left to crumble, streets overgrown with weeds. The physical landscape bore the scars of catastrophe, but the social and economic transformations would prove even more profound. The feudal system, already under strain, began to crack. With so many peasants dead, labor became scarce and therefore valuable. Surviving peasants found themselves in a position to demand better wages, better conditions, even freedom from serfdom. Lords who had once commanded absolute obedience now competed for workers, offering reduced rents, higher pay, and greater personal liberty. The old hierarchies, which had seemed eternal and divinely ordained, suddenly appeared negotiable. In England, attempts by the nobility to freeze wages at pre-plague levels led to deep resentment. The Statute of Laborers, enacted in 1351, made it illegal for workers to demand higher pay or for employers to offer it. The law was widely ignored and deeply unpopular. This discontent would eventually explode in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when thousands of peasants and artisans marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom and feudal obligations. Though the revolt was crushed, the old order could never fully reassert itself. The world had changed. Women who had taken on expanded roles during the crisis found some of their gains persisting. Widows controlled property and businesses. Young women, in a world with far more women than men, had greater choice in marriage partners or could choose not to marry at all. Convents, which had offered the only socially acceptable alternative to marriage, saw increased endowments and influence. Gender relations remained deeply unequal by modern standards, but the plague had opened cracks in the patriarchal structure. The Church faced a crisis of authority and faith. The failure of prayers to stop the plague, the death of so many priests and monks, and the moral collapse visible during the crisis had damaged the Church's spiritual credibility. People still believed in God, but they questioned whether the institutional church truly represented divine will. This skepticism would feed into later reform movements, contributing to the climate that eventually produced the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. The quality of the clergy declined sharply. With so many priests dead, the church was forced to ordain replacements quickly, often with minimal training and lower standards. Complaints about ignorant, immoral, or incompetent priests became commonplace. Criticism of church corruption, once whispered, grew louder. Writers like Chaucer in England mocked worldly friars and corrupt pardoners. The seeds of religious revolution had been planted. Economically, the plague created both winners and losers. The survivors, though traumatized, often found themselves wealthier. Inheritances from multiple relatives concentrated wealth in fewer hands. Those who controlled scarce resources, especially land and labor, could command premium prices. Some peasants and artisans rose to middle-class status or even higher. Social mobility, nearly impossible in the rigid pre-plague hierarchy, became achievable. But for the nobility and upper clergy who depended on feudal rents and tithes, the plague was an economic disaster. Their fixed incomes could not rise to match inflation, while their costs increased as they competed for scarce labor. Many noble families faced financial ruin. The relative power of merchants, bankers, and urban commercial interests grew, setting the stage for the rise of capitalism and the eventual decline of feudalism. Art and culture reflected the trauma. The pre-plague Gothic style, with its soaring optimism and heavenly aspirations, gave way to darker, more introspective themes. The Danse Macabre, depicting death as the great equalizer, appeared in manuscripts, murals, and sculptures across Europe. Literature became more pessimistic, more aware of mortality and suffering. The plague had taught that earthly life was fragile, and that neither virtue nor status could guarantee survival. Yet there was also renewal. The demographic catastrophe, by creating labor scarcity and concentrating resources, may have paradoxically contributed to the eventual economic growth that financed the Renaissance. With fewer mouths to feed, per capita wealth increased. Technology advanced as labor-saving innovations became economically valuable. Universities flourished as the newly wealthy invested in education. The intellectual ferment that would produce humanism, modern science, and global exploration grew from soil fertilized by plague. Recovery was neither quick nor linear. Populations would not return to pre-plague levels until the 16th or even 17th century in some regions. The plague itself returned periodically, preventing full recovery and maintaining a constant atmosphere of anxiety. But slowly, tentatively, Europe rebuilt. New families formed. Abandoned fields were reclaimed. Churches were repaired. Trade resumed. Life, as it always does, found a way forward. The survivors had learned a terrible lesson about the fragility of civilization. But they had also learned resilience. They had faced the apocalypse and endured. That knowledge, hard-won and bitter, became part of Europe's cultural inheritance, shaping its approach to crisis and renewal for centuries to come. 677 years have passed since the Black Death first landed on European shores. The mass graves have long since been built over. The ghost villages reclaimed by forest or plowed under by later generations. The names of most victims are lost to time, their stories untold except as statistics in history books. Yet the plague's shadow stretches across centuries, touching the modern world in ways both obvious and subtle. The Black Death fundamentally altered the trajectory of European history. It ended the Middle Ages not with the neat chronological boundary historians prefer, but with violence and trauma that shattered the medieval worldview. The Renaissance that followed grew from plague-enriched soil. The questioning of authority that would lead to the Reformation began with questions asked during the plague years. The scientific revolution emerged partly from the recognition that traditional authorities, the church, ancient physicians, astrologers, had failed completely to explain or combat the disease. Modern medicine owes a debt to the plague, though one paid in blood. The concept of quarantine, the importance of public health measures, the beginnings of epidemiology, all emerged from attempts to understand and control plague. The failure of medieval medicine forced a reckoning that eventually led to the germ theory of disease, to antibiotics, to modern public health infrastructure. We learned how to fight epidemic disease by failing catastrophically to fight the Black Death. The social transformations were equally profound. The decline of feudalism and serfdom, the rise of wage labor and capitalism, the increased social mobility, and the growing power of urban commercial classes, all accelerated by the demographic catastrophe of plague. The modern economy, with its emphasis on labor value and market forces, has roots in the post-plague labor shortage. One could argue that the Black Death, by destroying the old order, cleared space for modernity to emerge. Yet the plague also taught darker lessons that we have not fully absorbed. It revealed how quickly civilization can collapse, how fragile our social bonds are under stress, how easily fear transforms into violence and scapegoating. The persecution of Jews during the Black Death presaged later genocides. The breakdown of trust and community during the crisis echoes in every subsequent pandemic, including our own recent experience with COVID-19. And the plague never truly left. Yersinia pestis still exists, still occasionally infects humans. Modern antibiotics can treat it effectively if caught early, but pockets of plague persist in rodent populations across the world, from the American Southwest to Madagascar to Central Asia, where it all began. The bacterium that killed 50 million Europeans in the 14th century lives on, dormant but not extinct, a reminder that the age of pandemic disease is not safely past. Perhaps the most profound legacy is psychological. The Black Death taught Europe that catastrophe could strike without warning, that neither virtue nor status guaranteed survival, that the future was uncertain and death could come for anyone at any moment. This awareness, this existential anxiety, became woven into Western consciousness. It appears in art, in literature, in philosophy. The memento mori tradition, the contemplation of mortality, the sense that we live on borrowed time. These are plague inheritances, still recognizable in modern culture's often dark and anxious tone. We live in the world the plague made. Our cities, our economies, our philosophies, even our fears bear its imprint. When we face modern pandemics, we unconsciously reference the plague, our oldest and deepest example of how disease can reshape the world. When we speak of the fragility of civilization, the Black Death lurks in the background as proof that collapse is always possible. The dead of the Black Death are gone, but their world's ending made ours possible. We are, all of us, survivors of a catastrophe we never lived through, carriers of a trauma we inherited. And in the silence of abandoned villages reclaimed by time, in the mass graves beneath our modern cities, in the warning that history whispers across centuries, the Black Death reminds us: nothing is permanent. Nothing is guaranteed. and the line between order and chaos is thinner than we like to believe. The story ends, as all human stories must, with the knowledge that it will begin again. Somewhere. Somehow. And we will face it as they did. With fear, with courage, with the desperate hope that this time we might be ready. But we never really are.